Good afternoon. I'm Michael Markowitz. I'm director of the Institute for Retired Professionals. And I'd like to welcome you here to the new school, to the Institute for Retired Professionals, and to our very, very special Friday discussion series. We are committed at the IRP to representing one part of the new school's mission. That's educating the educated, helping the people who have educated deal with the world that changes and the changes in the world. And we've been very fortunate in being able to invite people who are provoking, who are provocative, and who help us think our way through new areas. And part of that is as a result of a gift we received to have these lectures by Marvin Tolkin, and Marvin Tolkin and Carol Tolkin are both here today. Would you stand up? 90 years. That's how long the new school has been part of the New York and the United States intellectual picture. It was founded to give people an access to education, people who would not normally be welcomed on campus at the time, so that women's studies, African American studies had great impetus and great push from the new school, whether it was W.E.B. Du Bois speaking about black studies, or Margaret Mead talking about aging and how a community deals with its aging people. That's all been part of the new school's history. We welcome you to explore our piece of it, which is the Institute for Retired Professionals, in which students themselves are encouraged to develop study groups, to attend and run study groups, and students themselves are encouraged to make a commitment to lifelong education. Today's talk will be on a different end of lifelong learning. And in order to introduce the speaker and get to the speaker, I'm going to introduce my two wonderful chairmen of our special events committee. Where are you? I'm sorry, Miriam Lawrence and Gloria Troy. And I'm going to turn, who's right here. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Miriam, who will introduce the speaker.
Well, I too have a chance to welcome you all to the first Fridays at One program for the fall 2009 semester. And we're so pleased to have as our kickoff speaker Simon Critchley, the English philosopher and chair and professor of philosophy right here at the New School. Simon earned his doctorate at the University of Essex and has published widely on a wide range of philosophical topics. A small sample includes Continental Philosophy, a very short introduction for Oxford University Press, On Humor, which is an exposition and analysis on the meaning and importance of humor, published in 2002, Things Merely Are, Philosophy and the Poetry of Wallace Stevens, 2005, Infinitely Demanding, 2007, which provides a systematic overview of Professor Critchley's philosophical position, and of course the Book of Dead Philosophers, which is our topic today, published in 2008, which in 2009 became a New York Times runaway bestseller. And more recently, he has published on Heidegger's Being and Time in 2008, and currently Simon is working on a book called The Faith of the Faithless for Harvard University Press, which is due for publication in 2010. So today, Simon will talk about the Book of Dead Philosophers in a program that he titled To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die, described by the Daily Telegraph as profound and frequently hilarious. Critchley is an engaging and deadpan guide to the metaphysical necropolis, bracingly serious and properly comic. Please join me in welcoming Simon Critchley.
Thank you for that introduction, Miriam, and Michael too. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I was here a few years ago, and it's nice to be back. This, as Michael said, this institutions like the IRP represent what's best and important about the New School, and we need to hang on to that at all costs. We're not a normal university. Yeah? We're a decidedly abnormal university, and it's a wonderful thing. I'm going to go shout out to the adventurers and Rebecca Schiffman's father, who might or might not be. Oh, hello there. Hi. I just promised to do that to Rebecca. And okay, so I'm going to talk about this rather questionable book, the Book of Dead Philosophers. But let me begin in a slightly different key. In his 1827 essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts, Thomas de Quincey writes, De Quincey says, "For gentlemen, it is a fact that every philosopher of eminence for the past 2 centuries has either been murdered or, at the least, been very near it. Inasmuch that if a man calls himself a philosopher and has never had his life attempted, rest assured there is nothing in him." And against Locke's philosophy in particular, I think it an unanswerable objection, if we needed any, that although he carried his throat about with him in this world for 72 years, no man ever condescended to cut it. As these cases of philosophers are generally good, well composed, and little known, I shall here read an excursus on that subject, chiefly by way of showing my own learning. Evidently, unless I'm speaking to you from beyond the grave, or I'm a zombie, which is not impossible, no one has ever succeeded in taking my life. But even worse, no one has ever even attempted to take my life. This is proof, according to De Quincey's criterion, if proof were needed, that I'm far from being a philosopher of eminence. If, after this talk, some person or persons might be inclined to murder me and thereby secure my posthumous philosophical glory, I would like to thank them in advance, to vicariously shake them by the hand, to wrap them in a warm, virtual hug. One lives in hope. In the meantime, I'd like to turn to De Quincey's infamous essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts. Its literary conceit, as old as Cervantes' Don Quixote, is that of the found manuscript. It's the purportedly edited text of the Williams lecture on murder considered as one of the fine arts. The lecture was ostensibly read before the Society of Connoisseurs in Murder to honor the homicidal gifts of one John Williams, who brutally murdered 7 people in the East End of London in 1811, and with whom De Quincey was unduly obsessed. For the anonymous Williams lecturer, every topic, he says, like a chamber pot, has 2 handles. This is especially true of murder, which might be treated morally, he says, as a rather bad thing, or aesthetically, quote, as the Germans call it. That is, in relation to good taste. A great gallery of murder is then produced, exhibited by De Quincey, and pride of place is given to those eminent philosophers who have either been murdered or came close to being cudgeled to death or having their throats slit. Those are De Quincey's 2 favorite modes of dispatch, the cudgeling and the throat slitting. There are good examples of cudgeling in the history of philosophy. Boethius is one. But these are the stories that De Quincey tells. Descartes came within an inch of being murdered on a ship by a bunch of Friesland sailors who discussed his demise as if he were a puncheon of rum, De Quincey says. Spinoza was murdered in his bed by an assailant only known through the initials LM. Hobbes was not murdered, De Quincey says, although it is very true that a man deserved a cudgeling for writing Leviathan. Okay? Malebranche was murdered by none other than Bishop Berkeley, where the material cause of the Irish clergyman's wrath was a disputation about the nature of idealism. Leibniz was not murdered, but thinking himself such an excellent philosopher, he died partly out of fear that he should be murdered and partly out of vexation that he was not. Kant, a man who could not possibly look more like a mummy when dead than he had done alive, De Quincey says, narrowly escaped murder in the most bizarre of circumstances. As is well known, the good wives of Königsberg used to set their clocks by the hour of Kant's daily constitutional walk. One day, for reasons unknown, a man decided to murder Kant and lay in wait for him by the side of the high road where the peripatetic philosopher was sure to pass. But then for reasons also unknown, the killer preferred to murder a child playing in the road instead of the aged transcendental idealist. In this way, the throat... I'm using the mic, am I? What's it going to... I use two mics, or... Okay. In this way, the throat of the Moses of the German nation, as Hölderlin would have put it, was spared. Those are the stories that De Quincey tells in his lecture. Now, sadly, salacious and saucy as these murderous details are, almost everything De Quincey says is completely false. An utter fiction and confection. But the topic is fascinating and worthy of some consideration. How did philosophers die? How did they meet their maker, if there is a maker to meet? How did they singularly and generally expire? And what lessons might their deaths teach us about the nature of philosophy and the nature of what philosophy is meant to teach, which is namely a readiness for death? In my view, the true story of the deaths of philosophers is even stranger than De Quincey's fiction. That's what I've written a book about, and it catalogues 190 demises from the pre-Socratics, Thales, until some very recent figures. I have an epigraph, which is from the great French essayist, inventor of the essay, Montaigne, which in many ways describes the intention of the book. Montaigne writes, if I were a maker of books, interesting hypothetical, if I were a maker of books, he says, I would make a register with comments of various deaths. He who would teach men to die would teach them to live. Now, I want to begin, this is sort of the comical beginning, but the serious beginning, if you like, from a serious and simple assumption. What defines human life in our corner of the planet at the present time is not just a fear of death, but, I think, an overwhelming terror of annihilation. Well, this book was written in Los Angeles, by the way, which is part of the shadow of the light. Anyway, we could talk about that if you like. This is a terror, both of the inevitability of our demise, with its future prospect of pain and possibly meaningless suffering, and the horror of what lies in the grave, other than our body nailed into a box and lowered into the earth to become worm food. We're led, on the one hand, to deny the fact of death and to run headlong into the watery pleasures of forgetfulness, intoxication, and the mindless accumulation of money and possessions. On the other hand, the terror of annihilation leads us blindly into a belief, sometimes, in magical forms of salvation and promises of immortality, offered by certain varieties of traditional religion and many New Age and some rather older age sophistries. What we seem to seek is either the transitory consolation of momentary oblivion or miraculous redemption in the afterlife. So I begin from this idea that what defines us in our corner of the planet is an overwhelming terror of annihilation. Death is the last great taboo. We are, as I try and put it somewhere else, anti-Victorians, in the sense in which the Victorians had a problem with sex, but no problem with death, and we're the opposite. As we're no problem with sex, we talk about it endlessly, and everyone has a right to whatever form of sexual expression they want, but death is sort of off limits. And that's what I'm trying to confront. Evasion and escape in relation to death. Now, in relationship to that initial thought, the ideal of the philosophical death has a sobering power. Cicero writes, but this is a sentiment that's axiomatic and which flows down the ages. Cicero writes, to philosophize is to learn how to die. To philosophize is to learn how to die. The main task of philosophy on this view is to prepare us for death, to provide a kind of training for death, the cultivation of an attitude towards our finitude that faces and faces down the terror of annihilation without offering promises of an afterlife. Montaigne writes of the custom of the Egyptians, who, during their elaborate feasts, caused a great image of death to be brought into the banquet hall, accompanied by a man who would call out to them and say, drink and be merry, for when you are dead, you will look like this. Right? This is the Egyptian anecdote. So during, as it were, feasting and banqueting, a skeleton would be brought into the banquet hall and someone would proclaim, eat, drink, and be merry, for when you are dead, you will look like this. I think there's a very interesting business opportunity here in relation to Manhattan restaurants. I think people could go in with skeletons, and I think there's potential business here. In terms of our corner of the planet, the culture, this is another topic for another lecture, but the culture in a sense which has a different relationship to death here, and I tried to talk about this when I was there, is Mexico. There's a Mexican popular culture of death, which is very different from what you find here. Los Dios de los Muertos and all the rest. That's another topic. Now, Montaigne derives the following moral from this Egyptian anecdote. And this is, I think, astonishing. He says, so, I have formed the habit of having death continually present, not merely in my imagination, but in my mouth. He says, not merely in my imagination, but in my mouth. To philosophize, then, is to learn to have death in your mouth, in the words you speak, the food you eat, and the drink that you imbibe. It's in this way, I think, with Montaigne, that we might be able to confront the terror of annihilation. For it is finally the fear of death that enslaves us and leads us towards either temporary oblivion or the longing for immortality. Montaigne writes, this is from the same essay. These words are extraordinary, I think. He says, he who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. He who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. The meaning of that is that slavery consists in slavery to the fear of death. It's that keeps us enslaved. Freedom would not consist in the denial of death, but in the acceptance of our mortality. So the condition of possibility, as philosophers would say, the condition of possibility for freedom is accepting that our existence is bounded by necessity, namely the necessity, the certainty of our demise. And without that necessity, freedom would mean nothing. And that's the paradox. That's the paradox. If we had infinite terrestrial life, it would rapidly become meaningless. Illustration. Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels. The characters that Swift calls the Struldbrugs. The Struldbrugs have immortality here on earth. You can identify them because they've got a black spot in the middle of their forehead, Swift says. And he describes the life of these Struldbrugs. You find them, he says, after centuries and centuries old, leaning against the wall with no interest in life, having no understanding of what's being said, having lost any concern, any understanding of the language, any concern with what's happening. Swift's point, and for Swift this is a religious point, but we can come to that, is that an immortal terrestrial life would be meaningless. Therefore, what gives a meaning and shape to life is our relationship to our mortality. Okay. It was a commonplace in antiquity that philosophy provides the wisdom necessary to confront death. That is, the philosopher looks death in the face and has the strength to say that it is nothing. The exemplar for this is, of course, Socrates. Philosophy, the standard narrative, begins with Socrates, which is to say, it begins with someone who's condemned to death for impiety to the gods and corrupting the youth of Athens, right? Philosophy begins with an act of political assassination. We should never forget that. Plato devotes 4 dialogues to the trial and death of Socrates. And then we have the testimony of Xenophon as well as other sources. So we know quite a bit about Socrates' death. Socrates says, in the Phaedo, which is the last of these dialogues, where his death is described. At the end of the Phaedo, it's an incredibly moving passage where Socrates is described taking the hemlock and feeling its effects and passing out of existence. His last words, the last words of Socrates are, "Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius." Mysterious phrase. Asclepius was the god of healing, the god of slumber. And so Socrates' last words is that we ought to remember to make an offering, make a sacrifice to the god who's the god of healing. The implication for Socrates is that death is a curative slumber. That's the thought. Philosophy begins with that extraordinary death scene. Socrates says in the Phaedo, true philosophers make dying their profession. True philosophers make dying their profession. If one has learned to die philosophically, then the fact of our demise can be faced with self-control, serenity, and courage. And what he means by that is that he also says in the Phaedo that what is the philosopher? He says the philosopher is already half dead because the philosopher doesn't really live in this world. The philosopher lives in another world, a world of ideas, a world of concepts. And that's where his attention is turned. To be a philosopher is to learn to orientate one's soul towards what Plato calls the good. So to be a philosopher is to be half dead. It's a strange thought. And then study. Listen, I could go on for this. I'll just back up here. What is it to read and to think? The word study, studium, in Latin, can be said to translate an interesting Greek word, which is ascesis, from which we get the term asceticism, or denial, or whatever. To learn to study a subject like philosophy is to learn, in a sense, to become dead. You sit there immobile. you want to leave that room and to run in the field, or you sit there for hours and days reading Spinoza really carefully, or whoever it might be. Anyway, there's more I can say about that. The Socratic wisdom finds its even more radical expression a few centuries later in the Stoicism of Seneca. Seneca writes, remember that Seneca, think about the history of philosophy, which is so interesting, is that we think of philosophy as an academic discipline. I get paid to teach students in a university. This is a very recent innovation. The first philosopher to get paid for teaching, major philosopher, was Kant, a little over 2 centuries ago. And he didn't even teach philosophy. He taught physical geography, meteorology, and all sorts of different things. The identification of the philosopher with the university is a modern invention. Seneca was the chief administrator in the Roman Empire. He was running the Roman Empire as he was writing these texts on the brevity of human life and all the shortness of life and how to face up to it. Seneca says, he will live badly who does not know how to die well. The philosopher for Seneca enjoys a long life because he doesn't worry over its shortness. Right? So the philosopher enjoys a long life because he doesn't worry over its shortness. What Stoicism for Seneca tries to teach is something great, supreme, and nearly divine, he says, a tranquility and calm in the face of death. Now, if there's one theme which recurs in the history of ancient philosophy, from the Greeks up to the Romans, but you can also find it in classical Chinese thought as well, it's an idea of being able to face death with tranquility, with calm, what the Greeks called ataraxia. And this is what the different schools of ancient philosophy tried to do. Again, big difference between contemporary modern philosophy and this stuff is that what am I doing? For the most part, I'm teaching graduate students with an idea that they'll have a career in teaching in higher education institutions, hopefully, if they're lucky. In ancient philosophy, philosophy was organized according to schools, and the function of those schools was to engage in a sort of therapy of desire, and to learn to not desire the wrong things and to desire the right things. That tranquility is something you can find recurrently in ancient philosophy, in people like Epicurus, and also in some modern philosophy as well. The great figure here, again, as I mentioned him in passing, would be Spinoza. Spinoza says in the Ethics, towards the end, a free man thinks of nothing less than death. Right? What he means by that is that what it means to be free is to overcome the fear of death. Now, going back to Seneca, he knew whereof he spoke. He had all but been condemned to death by Caligula. He had some difficult employers, Seneca. Right? He'd all been put to death by Caligula in 39, banished by Claudius on a charge of adultery with the emperor's niece in 41 AD, and eventually he was, when he was the most important intellectual figure in the Roman world and its chief administrator, he was forced to commit suicide by the emperor Nero. Nero is responsible for 3 deaths in my book. Petronius, if you want to talk about that, we can. St. Paul, allegedly, and Seneca. And Seneca writes, he says, I did know in what riotous company nature had enclosed me. Often had the crash of a falling building echoed beside me. Many who were linked to me through the forum and the senate and everyday conversation have been carried off in a night, which has severed the hands once joined in friendship. Should it surprise me if the perils which have always roamed around me should one day reach me? So Seneca knew the risks of his public position. And another issue that Seneca's death raises, which I just want to flag and we can come back to in discussion if you want to, is that in the ancient world, suicide was no ignominy. Right? In the case of Seneca, he was asked by his employer, Nero, to kill himself, as indeed was Petronius. And if he had not killed himself, that would have been dishonorable. So what you find throughout the ancient world is an argument in favor of suicide. The argument against suicide only emerges with Christianity in its philosophical form. And that's the idea that life is something that's given to one, it's a datum, but it's something over which one has no dominion. Therefore, to kill oneself is to assume the role of God and to thereby sin. Therefore, suicide is forbidden. And I would argue one of the things we need to think through is that question, the question of the legitimacy of taking one's life or not. And that's another story that I try to recount in the book in different ways. Now, although the actual manner of philosophers' deaths is not always as noble as Socrates, I want to defend the ideal of the philosophical death. In a world where the only metaphysics in which people believe is either money or medical science, or the former to buy the latter, and where longevity is prized as an unquestioned good, I do not deny this is a difficult ideal to defend. Yet it's my belief that philosophy can teach a readiness for death, without which any conception of contentment, let alone happiness, is illusory. Strange as it may seem, my constant concern in this project is the meaning and possibility of happiness, and the fact that whatever happiness might mean, it has to consist at some level in an acceptance of mortality. And the history of philosophy is an extraordinary archive for thinking about that question. I talked about Socrates. I could say more about that, but let me move on to another set of issues. The Book of Dead Philosophers is not a book of the dead, whether Egyptian or Tibetan. These exquisite ancient writings, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, carefully describe the rituals necessary to prepare with certainty for the afterlife. The Egyptian Book of the Dead consists of 189 spells. I've got 190 deaths as opposed to 189, so one more than that, to ensure that the soul passes to an astral or solar afterlife. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes the death rituals necessary to break the illusory cycles of existence and achieve enlightenment that allegedly comes with the realization of nirvana. The Book of Dead Philosophers is not a book of the dead in those modes, but the influence of these approaches is vast. From the secret doctrine of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society in the late 19th century through to Timothy Leary's psychedelic 1960s version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, achieved with the help of LSD, to the contemporary obsession with near-death experiences or out-of-the-body experiences, spawned by Raymond Moody's book from 1976, Life After Life. Such is the position that Nietzsche called European Buddhism, although there's a great deal of American Buddhism around as well. The crucial point is that in both the Egyptian and Tibetan books of the dead, and in their contemporary epigons, there's a risk of death becoming an illusion. Right? In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's obvious. Death is an illusion which we have to overcome, which we can overcome with the right rituals. My thesis is very simple. It's that death is a reality. Right? Death is a reality that we have to face. And furthermore, it's a reality, it's only in relation to that reality that we can structure what we think of as a self. Now, the approach to death that's encapsulated in, say, the Tibetan Book of the Dead finds expression, for example, in the words of the influential Bengali poet Tagore. He says, death is not extinguishing the light, it is putting out the lamp because the dawn has come. One can detect the influence of such approaches to death and dying in the still extremely widely read writings of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She fostered a depth psychological approach to dying patients based on the famous 5 stages of dying, which have become sort of axiomatic in how we think about palliative care: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. In On Death and Dying from 1969, each chapter begins with a citation from Tagore and the revealingly entitled 1974 book death, the final stage of growth, right, pays rather hyperbolic tribute to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now, I don't want to deny the undoubtedly beneficial therapeutic effects of such approaches. Far from it. My worry is that they cultivate the belief that death as an illusion is an illusion to be overcome with the right spiritual preparations. It is not an illusion, it's a reality that has to be accepted and affirmed. And perhaps the most pernicious feature of contemporary society is our unwillingness to accept that reality, and we flee from the fact of death, and we end up where I began, in the terror of annihilation. The Book of Dead Philosophers is rather a series of reminders, or memento mori, reminders of death. Rather than being the clarion call for a new esoteric dogma, it's a book of 190 question marks that might begin to enable us to face up to the reality of our death with seriousness, but also with some levity and humor. The history of philosophy is a history of question marks, right? Hundreds of them, which don't add up, each of which constitutes a singular and powerful temptation. And together they contradict each other. And that's the glory of the history of philosophy. 3,000 years and we've solved none of the major questions, right? Thankfully. But the history of philosophy is also the history of philosophers' deaths is a history of weirdness, madness, suicide, murder, bad luck, pathos, and some very dark humor. Let me give you some examples that you can peruse at greater length, should you be so disposed. Pythagoras allowed himself to be slaughtered rather than cross a field of beans. Heraclitus suffocated in cow dung. Plato allegedly died of a lice infestation. Aristotle is reported to have killed himself with aconite. Empedocles plunged into Mount Etna in the hope of becoming a god, but one of his bronze slippers was spat out by the flames in confirmation of his mortality. Diogenes died by holding his breath. There are 3 or 4 philosophers in antiquity that died by holding their breaths. So did the great radical Zeno of Citium. Zeno of Elea died heroically by biting a tyrant's ear until he was stabbed to death. Lucretius was allegedly killed himself by being driven mad by taking a love potion given to him by his wife. Hypatia, the greatest female philosopher in antiquity, was killed by a mob of angry Christians, and her skin was peeled off with oyster shells. Always beware mobs of angry Christians, particularly if they're carrying oyster shells. Boethius was cruelly tortured before being bludgeoned to death on the orders of the Ostrogoth king Theodoric. And during his time in prison, he writes The Consolations of Philosophy. John Scotus Erigena, the great Irish philosopher, was allegedly stabbed to death by his English students. Such is history. I'm from an Irish background. Avicenna died of an opium overdose after engaging much too vigorously in sexual activity. If there's one text from the history of, you might want to look at the life of Avicenna by Al-Juzajani. It's fascinating. Another thing about the history of philosophy is that if philosophers weren't civil servants, they were usually doctors, usually medics who were doing their philosophy on the side. Avicenna was one of those. So was John Locke. Aquinas died 25 miles from his birthplace after banging his head against the bough of a tree. Pico della Mirandola, meteor of the Italian Renaissance, was poisoned by his secretary, 25 years old. Siger of Brabant was stabbed by his secretary. William of Ockham died of the Black Death. Thomas More was beheaded, and his head was stuck on a pike on London Bridge. There's a wonderful story told in Aubrey's Brief Lives, which is one of the great texts, of Thomas More's daughter in a carriage proceeding under London Bridge and seeing her father's head on the pike. And she says, would that his head would fall into my lap. At which point the head fell into her lap and she took it back to their house in Chelsea, pickled it in wine, and then buried it in the ground sometime later in St. Dunstan's Cemetery in Canterbury. Galileo narrowly escaped the fate of being burnt alive by the Inquisition. Giordano Bruno wasn't so lucky. He was burnt alive by the Inquisition. Bacon, Francis Bacon, died after stuffing a chicken with snow in the streets of London to assess the effects of refrigeration on animal flesh. This is a typical, wonderful death. I mean, Bacon, who was the great philosopher of experimentation, traveling in his carriage through London, descends from it, suddenly has this intuition that maybe you can freeze animal flesh in snow. It's a snowy day in London. So he orders this woman to bring out a chicken, they slaughter it, and they proceed to cover it in snow to see whether the flesh will be refrigerated. He gets a chill, it turns into pneumonia, and he dies some days later. This is what we can call death by empiricism. Descartes died of pneumonia as a consequence of giving early morning tutorials in the Stockholm winter to the prodigious and cross-dressing Queen Christina of Sweden. Spinoza died in his rented rooms at The Hague while everyone else was at church. The death of Spinoza rapidly becomes legend. 3 biographies appear within 10 years. Leibniz, who was discredited as an atheist, the German rhyme was Leibniz glaubt nichts, Leibniz believes nothing, died alone and was buried at night with only one friend in attendance. The handsome and brilliant Irish philosopher John Toland died in such dire poverty in London that no marker was placed at his burial spot. Berkeley, a fervent critic of Toland and so-called freethinkers, died one Sunday evening on a visit to Oxford while his wife read him a sermon. Montesquieu, I like this one, died in the arms of his lover, leaving unfinished an essay on taste. The atheist materialist de la Métrie, who was also a doctor, died of indigestion caused by eating a huge amount of truffle pâté. And the deeper irony is that the feast was given in his honor by his patron in Prussia for curing him from a potentially fatal disease. And the consequence being that de la Métrie stuffs it with truffle pâté. Rousseau died of massive cerebral bleeding, which was possibly caused by a violent collision with a Great Dane, not the Danish prince, but the dog, on the streets of Paris 2 years earlier. Diderot choked to death on an apricot, presumably to show that pleasure could be had until the very last breath. There's a beautiful memoir of Diderot by his daughter, which describes this moment with great tenderness. They didn't even notice that he'd expired. His wife's last words were, "You shouldn't eat that. You shouldn't eat the apricot." And anyway, Condorcet was murdered by the Jacobins during the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. Hume and David, the good David, Le Bon David, as they call him in France, died peacefully in his bed after fending off the inquiries of Boswell as to the atheist's attitude towards death. Hume's death is very important. I mean, Hume is the first philosopher, as it were, to really come out in denying the immortality of the soul. And there's an article by Hume which defends the right to suicide, which is published posthumously. So he had this reputation of being a skeptic or an atheist. Boswell, Samuel Johnson's biographer, wanted to visit the dying Hume because he couldn't believe that an atheist could go to their death with contentment. And Hume, being Hume, admitted Boswell not just once, but on 2 separate occasions, during which Hume and Boswell discussed the nature or the possibility of the soul's immortality. At the end of which, in exasperation, Boswell said, "Do you not at least conceive the possibility that the soul is immortal?" And Hume said, "It is possible if I throw a piece of coal on the fire, it will not burn." Kant's last words was sufficit, it is enough. Hegel died in a cholera epidemic, and his last words were, only one man ever understood me, and he never understood me. Nur einer hat mich verstanden, hat mich nicht verstanden. Bentham had himself stuffed and sits on public view in a glass box at University College London in order to maximize the utility of his person. If you visit London, I urge you to go to the old building of University College London, the South Quad, and you can see Bentham in what looks like an old-fashioned telephone box, sitting there in his favourite outfit with his stick, dapple, and he was very much concerned with his demise. And he wrote a text called the Auto-Icon, in which he describes his wish for his own body to be a sort of icon that would ridicule religious icons. He was much concerned with the manner in which the New Zealanders, with which the English were at war for 30 years in the 19th century, pickled heads. And he wanted his own head to be pickled in such a manner. And he did that, and it went badly wrong. But in the last 10 years of his life, he carried in his pocket the artificial eyes that would go in his... Here was a man that faced death on a daily basis. Max Stirner was stung on the neck by a flying insect and died of the resulting fever. Kierkegaard's gravestone rests against that of his father in a Kierkegaard, a churchyard. Nietzsche made a long, soft-brained and dribbling descent into oblivion after kissing a horse in Turin. Moritz Schlick was murdered by a disturbed student who went on to join the Nazi Party. Wittgenstein died the day after his birthday, and his friend, Mrs. Bevan, gave him an electric blanket, saying, "Many happy returns." Wittgenstein replied, staring at her, "There will be no returns." And Wittgenstein's last words are wonderful. He says, because the next day after he died, he was working until the end, the extraordinary productive period. And the day after, he knew his friends who were visiting would arrive the day after his death. He knew he was going to die. And his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." It's an extraordinary remark. And if you know about Wittgenstein's life, it doesn't seem wonderful. Giovanni Gentile was executed by anti-fascist Italian partisans. Edith Stein died in Auschwitz. Simone Weil starved herself for the sake of solidarity with occupied France during the Second World War. Sartre said, "Death, I don't think about it. It has no place in my life." 50,000 people attended his funeral. Merleau-Ponty was allegedly discovered dead in his office with his face in a book by Descartes. Roland Barthes was hit by a dry cleaning van after meeting with the future French Minister for Culture. Freddie Ayer, A.J. Ayer, had a near-death experience where he reportedly met the masters of the universe after choking on a piece of salmon. It's an extraordinary story. Ayer was, sort of legendary skeptic, empiricist, atheist, English positivist philosopher. He was also irritable and rather full of himself. He ate some salmon after a lecture trip in the US and died for 4 minutes. And during this period, he had a near-death experience where the master of the universe appeared, two of them, one in control of space, one in control of time, and he saw himself walking up and down, twiddling his watch, trying to alert them to a sort of disorder that was happening in the universe, then suddenly he woke up. And his mood changed. And there's a wonderful story that his wife tells of a party after this happened, where his wife, Dee, is talking to... a friend talks to his wife, she said, "Freddie seems to be in wonderful form. He seems to be, very, very happy." His wife said, "Yes, he's so much better since he died." And anyway, Gilles Deleuze defenestrated himself from his Paris apartment in order to escape the dreadful sufferings of emphysema. Derrida, who's a great hero of mine, used to teach at the New School, died of pancreatic cancer at the same age as his father, who died of the same disease. My teacher, Dominique Janicot, died alone on a beach in August 2002, close to the foot of the Nietzsche path, the Chemin Nietzsche, outside Nice in France, after suffering a heart attack while swimming. Death is close and getting closer all the time. Funny, isn't it? My own view of death, to come to that, I want to make two more remarks, then I'll shut up, is closer to Epicurus. Epicurus, the great materialist philosopher of antiquity, has what he calls a four-part cure, the tetrapharmakos. It's very simple. Don't fear God, don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. Right? Don't fear God, don't worry about death. What is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. What people always get wrong about Epicurus is they think there's this thing called Epicureanism, which is about having pleasure. Epicurus was about minimizing pleasure. If your pleasures are minimal, so Epicurus says, bring me a barley cake and a glass of water, and I will be happy. Give me a small pot of cheese, and I will feast like a god, he says. The point of Epicureanism is to minimize your pleasures. If you minimize your pleasures, the absence of those pleasures will also minimize their pain. This is also Epicurus' argument against sex. Sex, he thinks, is too extreme a pleasure, and its absence is therefore causes too extreme a pain. Therefore, refrain from such activity. In the final of the four letters attributed to Epicurus, he makes this remark. It's an extraordinary comment. He says, get used to believing that death is nothing to us. For all good and bad consist in sense experience, and death is the privation of sense experience. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact of death makes the mortality of life a matter for contentment. Mortality of life a matter for contentment, not by adding a limitless time to life, but by removing the longing for immortality. By removing the longing for immortality. Or as Lucretius says some centuries later, it's the lure of immortality that keeps us constantly on the gasp, he says. The Epicurean view of death was very influential. It's of a sub-tradition in the history of philosophy. It's very simple. When death is, I am not. When I am, death is not. Therefore, it's useless to worry about it. Right? The only way of attaining the tranquility of soul is by removing the anxious longing for the afterlife. So that, let's say, is a persuasive version, at least to me, of the philosophical death. Let me sketch what's wrong with this approach in the last minute and what I want to go on to do next. Now, highly tempting as it is, the problem with this Epicurean position, the philosophical death, is that it fails to provide a cure for the aspect of death that is the hardest to endure. Not our own death, but the death of those we love. It's the death of those that we are bound to in love that undo us. It's the deaths of those that we're bound to in love that unstitch our carefully tailored suit of the self, that unmake whatever meaning we have made. In my view, odd as it may sound, it is only in grief that we become most truly ourselves. That is, what it means to be a self does not consist in some delusory self-knowledge, but in the acknowledgement of that part of ourselves which we have irretrievably lost. We are creatures that grieve, that mourn. The entire difficulty here is imagining what sort of contentment or tranquility might be possible in relation to the deaths of those we love. And that's a problem that I do not address adequately in the book. And the tradition which begins to think about those questions, I think, more adequately are varieties of religious tradition. For example, in the Christian tradition, there's a rich concern with mourning, and obviously elsewhere as well. That means that as it were, this is my critique of what I've done, is that the question that I don't raise, which I want to go on to next, is the question of love. Right? The question of love, for a very simple reason. If philosophy is a readiness for death, if to philosophize is to learn how to die, and philosophy is concerned with mortality, then love, it seems to me, is what pushes the bounds of our mortality. Right? Love, in my formulation, is that immortal dimension to the human self. That possibility for something that exceeds the limits of our life. Right? A sort of promise we make to the future. And it's that I want to try and begin to think about in whatever I get up to next. Sorry for speaking for so long. Thank you for listening.
We have time for questions, and we have Kim is here with a microphone.
There was a distinction in the way some people thought about the subject between the fact of death and the process of dying. And since you've also written on humor, you probably know the Woody Allen remark, I don't have any problem with death, I just don't want to be there when it happens.
That's right.
So my question to you is, do you think there is a distinction between death and dying that makes a difference?
Yeah, I do. And the reference to Tolstoy is interesting. The other Woody Allen remark, which I like, is that how do you distinguish comedy and tragedy? He says, how does he put it? Comedy is tragedy plus time, right? Comedy is tragedy plus time. And in a sense, I could say a lot more about that, because there's a sense in which it's the process of dying, or how we're to think about that. And roughly, I don't come to a view in the book. I'm tempted by the Epicurean view, which is about death. Death is nothing, right? I'm not going to be here, so why worry? Was I worried about the time before my birth? No. Therefore, why worry about the time after my death? They're the same. There was an eternity before you were born, there'll be an eternity after you're dead. If you're not worried about one, why be worried about the other? Right? There's a power to that. And when Spinoza says, the free man thinks of nothing less than death, you see, this is what Spinoza means by looking at things under the aspect of eternity. Sub specie eternitatis. What that doesn't capture is the fact that life is a first-person activity. Life is something that we are, the fact that there was an eternity of time before my birth isn't the same as the eternity of time after my death. Life has this structure. Right? It's an arrow that we project into the future. So therefore, my dying takes on a more central focus. And the way in which, I mentioned it at the end, the way in which I want to approach that or think about that is in relation to this question of grief, really. Because certainly for me, I don't know, I'd like to hear what you have to say. Death came into the world for me not through my concern about my death, but through the death of those that I love, parents or whatever. That's when death, that's when it stings, right? It's the helplessness in relationship to that, but also what that structure about, what we can say about that self that grieves, that mourns. I think it's incredibly important. I don't think mourning is something that we should be ashamed of, or something that should take a limited period. Remember, after 9/11, George W. Bush said, I think after 11 days, right, the time for mourning is over, right? This is a mistake, right? The time for mourning is very, very long, right? And it should be allowed to be very long. And what this means is that a self that grieves is a self that is, that is aware of its own dying, which is grieving over something that's lost. And it's that idea of the self that I want to I think it's rich and powerful and reminiscent of Tolstoy and other literary sources as well. So thank you for that.
Yes. How does the intense, committed, sincere belief in an afterlife, whether it be an Egyptian, whether it be the Christian, whether it be a Hindu with reincarnation, versus those who believe that in the worm afterlife, that you're in a box and the worms eat you and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
How does that affect the terror versus tranquility, acceptance of and perception of death?
That's the question, right? That's the question. I don't have an answer to it. I do not have an answer to that question. There can't be, an answer to that question which is going to stop that debate. I mean, it is simply a fact about human beings. Wherever human beings are formed into groups and settled and developed culture, that a belief in immortality is usually part of that culture, right? Often bound up with a belief in the ancestors and so on and so forth, but it's rare, if not, extremely rare, to find cultures without a belief in some version of immortality. So it seems to be something we long for, and I understand that. And on some days I can appreciate it very, very, very clear. For example, sometimes I'm asked, do you believe in the afterlife? And I'll say, yes, I do believe in the afterlife. I believe in the life of those people who will come after me, right? And that would be one way of saying, well, I believe in a very material idea of the afterlife. To have children is to believe in the afterlife, right? It seems to me that to have kids is to project something beyond your mortality. You're casting something out into the future. It's down to chance and luck and all the rest, but you hope. This is why having children, I think, is so essential. You're hoping that their existence will survive yours. And if it doesn't happen, it's tragic, right? We know that. So to that extent, a belief in the afterlife is a belief in the life of those that come after, in that idea of continuity of generations, makes an awful lot of sense to me. And there are versions of religious belief that are like that. There's a strand of Judaism that would be close to that. But those people that just believe in that there will be, I don't know, an immortal bliss of some sort. The philosophical answer is Socrates' answer. The only responsible so I'm not an evangelical atheist, right? I'm not a Dawkins or a Hitchens. I disapprove of both those characters in different ways, particularly Hitchens. But it seems to me that there is something that's being articulated in religious experience which is incredibly important to the sense of what it means to be human, and we can't simply throw that away. There was something else I was going to say which was of enormous relevance to what you were talking about. It just slipped out of my head. It would be, That's gone. It will come back. But thank you.
If we could philosophically accept our own death, and why would we have a problem accepting the death of our loved ones? It seems we're not consistent.
Yeah.
And what is it?
Well, there are different views on that. There are different views on that, and and what I'm trying to do, and what most of the book's reviewers haven't really picked up on, is that there are a variety of competing views out there. There's a wonderful story. There's a chapter on classical Chinese philosophy, which was occasioned by a trip to China a few years ago and just trying to deal with my ignorance when it came to classical Chinese philosophy. Chuang-Tzu, who's the most sort of the Woody Allen of the Taoists. It's a very wry, comical Taoism. There's a story of Chuang-Tzu after his wife has died, someone discovers him beating on a drum. He's beating on a drum and singing out loud. And the man says to him, well, how can you do that? I mean, your wife has just died. How can you be beating on a drum and singing? He says, well, why should I mourn? You know, why should I mourn? I mean, there was a time before existence. She existed. We did this. We did that. We had a lovely time. She's now dead. And I affirm that. I'll beat on the drum and sing. So there is that view, which in a sense we need to, the deaths of others is something we can also deal with. Right? I'm not so sure about that. I think there's something more to it than that. I'm very, because this is, I didn't mention this in the talk, but there's a wonderful moment in Augustine's Confessions where he's talking about the death of his mother. And his mother, Monica, Santa Monica, was near where I wrote the book. His mother has a complete disregard to the care of her body and the fact of her death, right? and she dies at Ostia outside Rome. And but Augustine then describes the torment that he suffered after her death. That he was torn in two, he said, by the fact of his mother's death. And not just that, the fact that he'd become a Christian meant that he knew that she'd gone to an afterlife and therefore he shouldn't mourn. So he didn't just feel torn by her mourning, he felt guilty for the fact of mourning. So the point being that I think, both these possibilities are open. There's a way in which, accepting one's own death can also lead to accepting other people's deaths. In a sense, but there's something about experience that doesn't capture for me.
I'm interested in, well, first of all, as you know, I have family in philosophy, but
Yep.
I'm a Freudian. And I believe mourning is a very important process.
Yeah.
So how you face your own death is one issue. I'd like to be an Epicurean. But in terms of mourning, which I have experienced after a long, long marriage, I think it's almost physical. You miss everything you do.
Yeah.
You cannot. You'd have to really be in denial. If you're really open to your own feelings, you're going to have to mourn, and it's a healthy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
My point, hopefully I've done that,
Mm-hmm.
is after a certain point, there is a certain amount of catharsis, and what you do is you live in the memories, and they become more and more beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very positive way of going on with your life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that would be the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And happy to say that I practice what I preach.
Well, no, I appreciate that, and very much. I think that Freud is exemplary here, both in his person, the story that I tell. I spent a lot of time on the Freud entry. As you know, Freud had 20, however many operations for varieties of mouth cancer. And he lived for the last 20 years of his life in constant pain. Awful, constant pain. In order to smoke cigars, right? He lived to smoke cigars in order to work. And he said, I would rather think in pain than not be able to think without pain. He refused any medication until the end. Another interesting question that looking at the history of philosophy brings up, when we look at all these deaths, is that an awful lot of these deaths are deaths in extreme pain. Epicurus, right, who dies surrounded by his disciples, proclaiming the benefits of philosophy and the need for tranquility and calm, dies of kidney stones in 2 weeks of great torture. And yet he says that pain still, he doesn't, as it were, shirk that. again, there's a sense in which our conception of death has obviously been changed pharmacologically, right? And this is something we need to think about. Okay. Freud has a hard lesson in Mourning and Melancholia. He says that mourning, when we mourn that beloved aspect of our life which has disappeared. Right? And its absence tears us into pieces. And yet, he says, and yet we can overcome that. We can overcome that by, as it were, internalizing that love through an act of memory, and if we're really lucky, learning to love again. Right? There's that. And it's a hard lesson in Freud. If that doesn't happen, he says, then we can end up in melancholy, in depression of a much more dramatic kind. And that's the risk. I mean, my point would be that is that I agree with you that mourning is an incredibly important process that has to be acknowledged, and the idea of there being, I mean, what's so wrong with our society is the fact that we don't have public rituals around mourning, right? That death is something that we just cannot face or deal with. It's something that we shuffle off the public realm, we hide away. I mean, death should be central, it should be celebrated, it should be marked, it should be ritualized, it should be, and we did that. Most cultures do that, and we did that in the 19th century. Something has gone badly wrong with a society that is obsessed with youth, right? And artificially extended youthfulness and longevity at all costs, it seems to me.
Well, what's wrong is that, not wrong, but it's changed, is the end of religion. Because that's what gave people that solace. I mean, I used to work with people who had faced mourning issues, done it for many years, and those who believed in God made life a lot easier for them. Those of us who may not have a conception of God, mourning is much more difficult, and facing our own death is much more difficult. But for me, on a personal level, talk about mourning on a personal level, what concerns me is not the fact that I'm going to die. I can accept that. It's the unknown of that troubles me. Yeah. And that's something I don't know how one learns to live with, actually.
Okay. I've now remembered what I was going to say to you. It's now come back. Let's see if I can just keep it in there. The Socrates, in the Apology, not in the Phaedo, in the Apology, after having been condemned to death, right? So this jury decided that he's going to be condemned to death for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Says, well, death is fine. It's one of two possibilities. It's either eternal life, which for the Greeks meant Hades. It was sort of dark, cold place, but it was eternal life of a sort. And you could hang out there with Homer, Hesiod, and the rest of the guys and meet your friends as well. There's that possibility. Or, he says, it's a long, dreamless sleep. And what could be more pleasant than that? And he says, which of those possibilities it is, I do not know. Only God knows that, he says. Again, what Socrates means by God at that point is unclear, but only God knows. So the only responsible philosophical response to that question of death is to say that I don't know. Right? About the afterlife, I don't know. I mean, if you think that you know, you're playing into the same desire for certainty, which, I mean, philosophy is out for. What philosophy is in the business of doing is trying to show that people who are absolutely certain of what they believe have got questions which need to be addressed, right? The philosopher doesn't know. That's what Socrates insists. Now, the afterlife, I think it depends what story we tell about the afterlife. I did a piece for the New York Times in June, I think, called How to Make It in the Afterlife. And it was, and the thought that struck me, because it was, the editor asked me to do something, on this topic, because it had come up in some blog entries in the Times. And he said, so I looked at the question, why should the afterlife always be a question of my afterlife, right? Because the Greeks had this wonderful expression, call no man happy until he is dead, right? call no man happy until he's dead, meaning that, you could lead a perfectly honorable, wonderful life and still screw it up in the last week, the last day, and die dishonorably, in which case your life would be looked at negatively. So for the Greeks, the afterlife consisted in the stories that were told about that person's life after their death. So happiness consists in that, and that's what the Greeks call glory. Glory was not, as it were, my everlasting glory in heaven. It was my glory consisted in the stories that were told about me after my death. I think this is another crucial aspect of how we relate to death, dying, and mourning. It's in the construction of narratives. Right? This is why, my family's from Liverpool in the north of England, sort of Irish Catholic jet trash family that I'm from, and my first memories are of going to my great-grandmother's funeral, which was an open-top funeral with the corpse in the middle of the room, the curtains drawn. You had to go in and kiss the corpse and say your farewell. And then around the edge of the room, it was a small room where people sitting drinking whiskey and telling stories about the person that had died. And that seems to be, and then sometime later they began to steal the furniture, things like that would happen. But what was important about that was that the act of memorization, as a public act, as an act of a shared act anyway, that stories were told, and to that extent, I believe in the afterlife in that sense. It's a question of what stories we tell about people, and that as a shared public act, hugely important, it seems to me.
Yes. Excuse me. The idea of the afterlife, when did that originate?
Oh, right.
And is it not because, you can tell me if I'm incorrect, that humans did not accept death because that was the end? There couldn't be an end. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, didn't the afterlife develop as an idea philosophically because of that? And can you tell me who before the Egyptians had that way of thinking?
About the afterlife?
Yes, because we know the Egyptians did. We know that.
I don't know.
Does it go back further in time?
I think it does. I'm pretty sure it does. I just don't know the answer to that. The afterlife changes its shape, right? Particularly with the rise of the great monotheisms, but it seems to be a constant. Again, usually in relation to the ancestors, in relationship to place, that we need. So there is the idea, which is a very common feature, that the place where we live, the group that the community that we have, is watched over by the ancestors, and they're in a sense. You're right, because the idea that this is going to come to an end is awful. The point I'm trying to make in this work is to accept that, yes, the idea that our existence has an end is difficult to accept, if not impossible to accept. What the history of philosophy can do is to give you a range of examples of people that dealt with that in different ways. Right? We have. This is why the opening quotation from Montaigne is so important to me. That he who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. That to, as it were, not to be able to accept that life has an end, is in a sense to be a slave to that end. Right? And if you like, the philosophical task becomes one of, with enormous difficulty, with enormous persistence, being able to accept that life has an end, and that one's freedom and happiness consists in accepting that. It's a struggle, sure, absolutely, I completely agree.
The last question goes to front. Can you wait one moment for the mic?
I remember reading an article of a woman who decided to commit suicide, rational suicide, I would like to know your views about this.
Okay,
Facing death,
okay.
but doing it in a sort of loving way
Yeah.
with the family and so forth.
Let me give you the answer in two parts, because it's a hugely controversial issue, right? And it's one that I've tried to think about a little. Once Christianity comes on the scene, suicide is prohibited. Right? Suicide is prohibited, and all philosophers that are within the orbit of Christianity accept that prohibition. Things begin to break down in the 18th century. There's this text that I found, thanks to an Italian friend, incredibly obscure text by someone called Radicati di Passarano, which is a philosophical dissertation upon suicide, 1732. And this is the first text that I know of which defends the right to suicide. And it led to a spate of people taking their lives in London in the year after. This character, Radicati, was chased out of England and died in the United Provinces in the Dutch Republic after having converted back to Protestantism. The philosophical figure who really first defends the right to suicide is David Hume. And Hume's view is that one must have the right over one's life, right, to choose whether one lives or dies. And he says, no man or woman ever threw away their life willy-nilly, right? It's not something you're just going to decide to do. So it seems to me that debates in the West are still very much in the shadow of that Christian conception of suicide. Think about the debates that arose after the Terry Schiavo case some years ago. So that's the history of it. And I think we need to grow up and think in a little bit more of a mature way about the question of suicide. You know, from both points of view. My personal view is that people do not throw away their lives willy-nilly, and if there's a situation where the case of a terminal illness or whatever, people should have the right to take their own lives. That's my view. And in Britain, this is the whole debate that arose around this organization Dignitas in Switzerland, where you've got a lot of cases, or a certain number of cases of people with terminal illnesses on their own, or in some cases couples, who travel to Zurich, and Dignitas, they have a voluntary death, because suicide is still illegal in Britain. Now, it seems to me that we need to, at the very least, grow up and have a debate about that. Thank you for listening.